For over 2 decades, Judge Lorraine Mercer had ruled her courtroom like a queen, unyielding, untouchable, and merciless. She wasn't just feared, she was the system. Lawyers whispered her name in hushed conversations, defendants barely dared to look her in the eye, and prosecutors knew that as long as they followed her lead, their cases were already won before the trial even began. Inside courtroom 6B of the Fulton County Courthouse, the air was thick, not just from the Georgia summer heat pressing against the marble walls, but from something far heavier, a suffocating sense of inevitability. Everyone knew how today's trial would go. They always did. At the defense table, Caleb Morris adjusted his tie, his movement slow, deliberate. He was no rookie, no naive public defender walking blindly into the lion's den. He knew exactly who Lorraine Mercer was and what she had done, and today he was here not just to defend his client, he was here to break the legacy of corruption she had built. Across the courtroom, Trey Carter sat stiffly in his chair. The suit he wore was borrowed, slightly too big at the shoulders, the cuffs frayed. It didn't matter. To Judge Mercer, he was still just another black man in the system, another statistic, another case number she would discard without a second thought. The evidence against Trey was a joke, a grainy surveillance video showing a hooded figure, no clear face, no defining features, an unreliable eyewitness, a convenience store clerk who had changed his statement more than once, a gun found miles away, no fingerprints, no connection. Any other judge would have thrown the case out before it ever reached trial, but Mercer wasn't any other judge. The room settled into an eerie silence as Mercer took her seat. She perched high above the courtroom, peering over her glasses with that same cold, calculating stare she had perfected over the years. Her presence alone demanded submission. A single sigh, a slight tilt of her head, the slow, deliberate tap of her gavel, small gestures that carried immense weight. She adjusted her robe and cleared her throat. "We will now begin the proceedings. Prosecution, you may present your case." From across the room, Adam Lawson, the young prosecutor, stood. His suit was crisp, his posture straight, but Caleb could see the hesitation beneath it. Lawson was still new, still learning how to navigate Mercer's courtroom. But he wouldn't need to be good. Mercer would guide him. She always did. As Lawson spoke, Caleb didn't hear a word of it. He was too focused on Mercer, watching, calculating. She thought this would be just another case, another easy conviction. But today, she was wrong. Today wasn't just a trial. Today was the beginning of her downfall. The tension inside courtroom 6B was palpable, pressing against the walls like a heavy weight. The trial had barely begun, yet everyone present already knew the outcome. Because in Judge Lorraine Mercer's courtroom, the verdict was never about evidence. It was about power. At the defense table, Trey Carter sat stiffly, his hands clasped together, fingers twitching. He was trying to steady his breathing, but it was no use. He had seen this before, the way the system worked. The way men like him were already guilty the moment they walked through those courtroom doors. He had been raised to believe in justice, but experience had taught him otherwise. Across the room, Prosecutor Adam Lawson adjusted his tie, flipping through his notes. His arguments didn't have to be airtight, the case didn't have to be strong. Mercer had already decided Trey's fate long before today. The so-called evidence against Trey was flimsy at best. A blurry surveillance video of a hooded man, no clear face, no defining features. A single eyewitness, an elderly store clerk whose memory had conveniently improved over time. A gun found miles away, no fingerprints, no direct link to Trey. If this trial were happening in any other courtroom, Caleb Morris knew he could have had the case thrown out before opening arguments. But this was Mercer's courtroom, and here the rules didn't apply. From the bench, Mercer peered over her glasses, her sharp gaze locking onto Caleb. She knew exactly who he was. She had heard the whispers, the stories about him. a defense attorney with a reputation for going after corrupt officials, a man who didn't just fight cases, he fought the system itself. But Mercer wasn't intimidated. Not yet. She had seen men like him before, and none of them had ever won. "Mr. Lawson, proceed," she said, her voice smooth, practiced, dripping with authority. Lawson cleared his throat and turned toward the jury, his confidence bolstered by Mercer's unspoken backing. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this case is about one thing: accountability." Caleb nearly scoffed. Accountability. That was rich, coming from a prosecution built on fabricated evidence and racial bias. Lawson continued, laying out the state's argument as if it were undeniable truth. Trey had been seen fleeing the scene, the eyewitness identified him, a weapon had been recovered, open and shut case. Caleb could feel the jury shifting in their seats, some skeptical, others already convinced. That was Mercer's greatest trick. She didn't need to say much. Her presence alone manipulated the room, steering opinions before a word was spoken. Then she turned to Caleb. "Mr. Morris," she said, barely masking her disinterest. "Your opening statement." Caleb stood, adjusting his cuffs. He wasn't just about to argue Trey's innocence. He was about to expose the rot beneath the surface. Today he would show them all that the system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. Caleb Morris rose from his chair, buttoned his suit jacket and took a slow step forward. The courtroom felt heavier now, the weight of expectation pressing down on every person inside. This wasn't just another defense argument. This was a direct challenge to Judge Lorraine Mercer's authority. He turned toward the jury, his voice measured but firm. "Justice isn't a guessing game. It isn't a performance. It isn't about winning or losing. It's about the truth. And the truth is, this case should have never made it to trial." Before he could continue, Mercer's gavel cracked against the bench. "Mr. Morris," she said, her tone sharp, clipped, "we're not here for a speech. Stick to the case." Caleb met her gaze, unflinching. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I am sticking to the case. I'm talking about due process. I'm talking about a young man's future, one that shouldn't be decided on faulty evidence." Mercer's eyes narrowed. "Proceed carefully, Mr. Morris." Caleb exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. She wanted him to lose control, to snap, to play into her hands. He wouldn't give her that. He turned back to the jury. "The prosecution claims this case is open and shut, but let's take a look at what they're actually presenting." He picked up a copy of the surveillance still. This grainy image shows a man in a hoodie. No defining facial features, no identifying characteristics. Yet, the prosecution wants you to believe, beyond a reasonable doubt, that this is Trey Carter. The jury members shifted slightly, some exchanging glances. They weren't blind. They could see the holes. Caleb walked toward the evidence table and held up a police report. "And then we have the eyewitness testimony," he continued. "Harold Simmons, the store clerk, initially told the police, and I quote, 'I didn't get a good look at him. It all happened so fast.' But weeks later, after meeting with law enforcement again, he suddenly remembers Trey's face. That's convenient, don't you think?" Across the room, Prosecutor Adam Lawson tensed in his seat. He wasn't experienced enough to hide his discomfort. Then came the final strike. Caleb placed another document on the evidence screen. "The prosecution's financial report. This," he said, "is proof that Harold Simmons received a direct deposit of $5,000 just 3 days after making his revised statement." A hush fell over the courtroom. The jury stiffened. Even the reporters in the gallery started writing faster. Mercer's grip on her gavel tightened. "Mr. Morris, are you accusing a witness of being paid off?" Caleb turned back to her, his voice unwavering. "I'm not accusing anyone, Your Honor. I'm presenting the facts." For the first time, Judge Mercer didn't respond immediately. She had spent years controlling this courtroom, but now she felt it the first crack in the foundation of her power. And Khaled wasn't done yet. The air in courtroom 6B was no longer just heavy. It was electric. The tension wasn't just felt. It was seen in the tight grips on pens, the shifting glances, the beads of sweat forming on foreheads. Caleb Morris had just delivered a direct hit, and the impact rippled through the room. Judge Lorraine Mercer's fingers tightened around her gavel. Her usual mask of composure was still in place, but Caleb could see it, the slight tension in her jaw, the way she exhaled, just a little too slowly. From across the courtroom, Prosecutor Adam Lawson swallowed hard. His once confident demeanor had started to crack. He had been trained to follow Mercer's lead, to trust that her control over the courtroom was absolute. But for the first time, it wasn't. Caleb turned back toward the witness stand. Harold Simmons, the prosecution's key witness, sat rigid, his hands gripping the wooden edge. His face had lost some color. Caleb let the silence stretch, let the weight of the moment settle on Simmons' shoulders. Then he took a slow step forward. "Mr. Simmons," Caleb said, his voice smooth but edged with quiet intensity, "I'm going to ask you one more time. Did you actually see Trey Carter that night, or did someone help you remember?" Simmons' fingers twitched. He glanced toward Adam Lawson, as if searching for guidance, but Lawson wasn't looking at him. Caleb pressed on. $5,000 is a lot of money. It could be life-changing for someone struggling to make ends meet. So tell me, Mr. Simmons, did you identify Trey Carter because you were sure, or because someone made it worth your while? Simmons' throat bobbed as he swallowed. His lips parted, then closed again, a moment too long. A second of hesitation too obvious. The jury noticed. Judge Mercer's voice sliced through the air. "Mr. Morris, that's enough." She slammed the gavel down hard. But Caleb didn't flinch. Instead, he turned toward her, holding her gaze. "With all due respect, Your Honor, it's not enough. It's never enough when a young black man's life is on the line." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Even the most seasoned court reporters were scribbling furiously now. Mercer leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Caleb like a predator sizing up prey. "You are dangerously close to contempt, Mr. Morris." Caleb's lips curled into a slow, knowing smirk. "I think we both know that's not what you're really worried about." For the first time in 20 years, Lorraine Mercer felt something unfamiliar in her own courtroom. She wasn't just losing control, she was losing the game. And Caleb wasn't done playing. The walls of courtroom 6B felt smaller now, as if the very structure itself was closing in. Judge Lorraine Mercer's grip on her courtroom, on her kingdom, was slipping, and she knew it. She had spent decades controlling everything within these walls. Her rulings were law, her decisions were absolute. But now, for the first time, the balance of power was shifting. Caleb Morris stood at the defense table, steady and unmoving. He had spent years preparing for this kind of moment. The moment when a system built on unchecked authority finally began to crack. And Mercer felt it. She tightened her jaw. "Mr. Morris, I am warning you for the last time." Caleb didn't wait for her to finish. He took another step forward, his voice calm but edged with something undeniable. Momentum. "Your Honor, the jury has a right to hear the full truth," he said. "But in this courtroom, truth has always been dictated by power. Isn't that right?" A murmur spread through the gallery. Even the court officers, the very people who had stood by Mercer for years, seemed uneasy now. Mercer exhaled sharply, but she wasn't just annoyed, she was rattled. She looked toward Prosecutor Adam Lawson, hoping for a lifeline. But Lawson looked lost. His hands gripped his notes, but he wasn't flipping through them anymore. He was just holding on, as if bracing for impact. Caleb turned toward the jury, keeping his voice even, controlled. "This isn't just about Trey Carter." He gestured toward his client, who sat motionless, watching his fate play out like a spectator in his own trial. This is about every man who was sat in that chair before him, every man who was never given a chance, every man whose verdict was decided before the trial even began. Judge Mercer's knuckles turned white around the gavel. She slammed it down, once, twice. "Enough, Mr. Morris." But her voice didn't carry the same weight it once did, and Caleb knew it. The jury did too. He took one more step forward, his words striking with precision. "You're afraid, aren't you?" Mercer's eyes flared. "Excuse me?" "You're afraid because, for the first time, you're the one being judged." Silence. A long, suffocating silence. Then the doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. Two men in dark suits stepped in, their expressions unreadable, their badges unmistakable. And just like that, the walls of Lorraine Mercer's courtroom began to crumble. The tension in courtroom 6B reached a breaking point as the two federal agents stepped forward, their presence like a wrecking ball against the once unshakable walls of Judge Lorraine Mercer's domain. She sat frozen, gripping the gavel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The authority she had wielded for over 2 decades was slipping through her fingers like sand. The lead agent, Special Agent Daniel Reyes, pulled out a folded document from his coat pocket and held it up for the entire courtroom to see. His voice was calm, controlled, but carried the weight of something final. "Judge Lorraine Mercer," he announced, "you are under federal investigation for bribery, obstruction of justice, and repeated violations of civil rights law." A collective gasp spread through the courtroom. The whispers turned into a buzz, then into a rising murmur of disbelief. From the defense table, Caleb Morris didn't move. He had anticipated this moment, had worked for this moment. But still, seeing Mercer's carefully crafted world collapse in real time was something else entirely. Judge Mercer forced herself to sit up straighter. Her voice, though shaken, still carried the remnants of authority. "This is absurd," she snapped. "You have no right to disrupt my courtroom in the middle of a trial." Agent Reyes remained unfazed. "With all due respect, Your Honor, we have every right." He held up the arrest warrant. "This is signed by a federal judge. You will come with us." She turned sharply to the courtroom officers, men who had enforced her rulings without question for years. "Stop them," she ordered. No one moved. For the first time in her career, Mercer looked into the faces of those who had once feared her and found nothing but indifference. She wasn't untouchable anymore. Her breath hitched. She turned to Prosecutor Adam Lawson, looking for a way out, but the young man only stared down at his desk, his hands gripping his notes like a man clinging to a life raft. He wasn't going to save her. No one was. Mercer's pulse pounded in her ears. She reached for the phone on her desk, pressing a number she knew by heart. It rang. 1, twice. Voicemail. Her lifeline, the powerful connections that had protected her for years, were gone. Her fingers trembled as she lowered the phone. For the first time, Lorraine Mercer felt something foreign crawl up her spine. Fear. The gavel, once her symbol of power, slipped from her grasp, hitting the desk with a dull thud. And just like that, her reign was over. For the first time in over 2 decades, courtroom 6B didn't belong to Judge Lorraine Mercer. She stood frozen, her once commanding presence reduced to nothing more than a shadow. The federal agents approached, their expressions unreadable, their movements precise. The cuffs clicked shut around her wrists. A stunned silence filled the room. The sound of her power collapsing wasn't loud. It was in the absence of sound. No protests, no defense. Just the quiet realization that her reign was truly over. As she was escorted down the steps of the bench, past the jury, past the attorneys, past the very people who had once feared her, no one looked away. No one spoke. She had sentenced hundreds, maybe thousands, in this very courtroom. Now she was the one being led away. From the defense table, Trey Carter sat motionless, watching everything unfold. For so long he had been bracing himself for the worst. His fate had never been in his hands. Now, for the first time, it was. Caleb Morris turned toward the new judge, a temporary replacement who had been called in at the last minute. A fair judge. A real judge. Given the overwhelming evidence of judicial misconduct, Caleb said, the defense moves for an immediate dismissal of all charges against my client. The new judge, a man known for his integrity, took only a moment to decide. Motion granted. All charges against Mr. Carter are hereby dismissed. The words rang through the room like a final verdict on Mercer's legacy. For the first time in years, Trey Carter was free. A heavy exhale escaped his lips, his hands trembling as the bailiff removed his restraints. He stood, his legs unsteady, as if his body wasn't sure how to exist without chains. He turned toward Caleb, eyes filled with something unfamiliar. Relief, gratitude, freedom. "Thank you," he whispered. But Caleb shook his head. "Don't thank me. Just go live your life." As Trey stepped out of the courtroom and into the world as a free man, Caleb lingered for a moment, looking around the room. The system was still broken. There would always be more cases, more battles, more Mercers hiding in plain sight. But today, justice had won. And Caleb wasn't done fighting. Final thoughts and lessons learned. For over 2 decades, Judge Lorraine Mercer ruled with unchecked power, deciding fates with a gavel that never wavered in the face of injustice. She built a system designed to silence, to oppress, to control. But in the end, she fell to the very thing she tried to suppress: the truth. This case wasn't just about Trey Carter. It wasn't just about one innocent man fighting for his freedom. It was about the countless others who never got this chance. The lesson here is clear. No one is above the law. Those who abuse their power will eventually face justice. Silence enables corruption. Had Caleb Morris not fought back, Mercer's legacy of injustice would have continued. Justice isn't automatic. It has to be fought for. The system doesn't change on its own. It takes people willing to stand up and challenge it. But the fight isn't over. There are more Mercers out there, more cases like Trey Carter's, more battles waiting to be fought. That's why we need to keep this conversation alive. If you believe in real justice, make your voice heard. Drop a comment below. What did you think of today's story? Have you ever witnessed injustice firsthand? Let's talk about it. Smash that like button if you believe no one should be above the law. Share this video with someone who still believes that the system always works the way it should, because stories like this prove otherwise. And don't forget to subscribe. We bring you the stories that matter, the ones that challenge the system, the ones that push for real change. Because justice isn't just a concept, it's a fight. And we're not done fighting.